On April 26, 1865, the 16th New York Cavalry Regiment found John Wilkes Booth and David Harold hiding in a tobacco barn. They waited for hours for them to come out, reasoning with them, but they wouldn't. David Harold surrendered eventually, but John Wilkes Booth was holding out until they started setting the barn on fire. And then one soldier saw Booth raise his rifle, and that's when he decided to pull the trigger. And today is about his story. We're talking about Boston Corbett, otherwise known as Lincoln's Avenger. Welcome to another history podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Rittenauer, and today we're talking about the insane life of Boston Corbett. He was a God-fearing man who put everyone else before himself, quite literally. He went through so much struggle and strife. The man did 4 tours for the Civil War and did a 4-month stint in Andersonville prison that would forever change his health and his thinking on life. And then later on became Lincoln's Avenger. He was the man who shot John Wilkes Booth. It is an insane story, and let me tell you about it. There's a lot of speculation as to when Boston Corbett was born, and he was born as Thomas H. Corbett in 1830 or 1832. His father was Bartholomew Corbett, and his mother was Elizabeth Corbett, and they lived in London, England. His father, Bartholomew, was a taxidermist and naturalist. His mother, there's not a lot of records of what she did in life. She's not really in this story a lot anyhow, but we'll get more into that. During the rise of the British Empire, naturalists and taxidermists were in high demand. That's because they helped them catalog every living species that they knew and helped them corner the market on cash crops from rubber to opium. It was a huge deal, but that was not the case for Bartholomew Corbett. He was not a successful naturalist or taxidermist in London. To be that, you have to have really good connections and be rather wealthy. Despite Britain's massive hard-on for taxidermy and naturalism, Bartholomew and the Corbetts were barely scraping by. Most of the time, taxidermists were tanners, tailors, or cobblers, and they did it on their free time because the right bird mount could bring in a few extra shillings to the household. Living in extreme poverty in London led Bartholomew to look for new life in America. In 1840, Bartholomew and his 3 children, 13-year-old Emma, 10-year-old Thomas, and 9-year-old John, all boarded the 630-ton Zenobia for their trip across the Atlantic Ocean. For unknown reasons, Elizabeth stayed behind in London. Some speculations say that she stayed behind until Bartholomew could afford to send for her and their belongings. Other speculations say that she stayed behind because she felt the stability for her and the younger children. So Bartholomew and his 3 children, and mind you, Bartholomew was 59 in 1840. At the age of 59, took 3 children on a thousands of mile long journey across the Atlantic Ocean on a ship to America. Like, that is absolutely insane. Could you imagine trying to take 3 kids in your prime across the Atlantic Ocean? No thanks. The journey took about a month, and then they landed in New York. New York City in the early 1840s was already absolutely massive, with a population of about 312,000, and it was only getting bigger. Just like in London, the Industrial Revolution was causing insane poverty throughout the city. Poverty was so rampant in the city because, of course, the Industrial Revolution, the mass influx of immigrants, and there was a financial crisis that hit the city in 1837 that they still hadn't recovered from. The Corbetts settled a few blocks from the 5 Point slums, but with the mass influx of immigrants, they were getting overwhelmed, so Manhattan had to expand north outside of the disease-filled 5 Point slums. In 1840s alone, Manhattan's population increased by 60%, fueled by the potato famine-driven mass exodus from Ireland, and many, many more immigrants coming from all over the world to find new life in America. And due to the immigrants and mass influx of citizens to New York, Horace Greeley recorded that 2 out of 3 New Yorkers in the 1840s were bringing in less than $1 a week for their households. That is next to nothing. He predicted that there was roughly 50,000 New Yorkers in the next week that wouldn't be able to afford food or rent. Later in 1849, Bartholomew packed up his family and joined the northern migration into Manhattan, and that's where they would find their living until later when Bartholomew decided to move back to London. It's unclear how Bartholomew Corbett made his living as a naturalist. It wasn't a very popular occupation in New York. He didn't have any formal training whatsoever in the field. His name didn't show up in any of the growing literature of his time. Bartholomew was more likely a taxidermist, preparing dead animals for hunters' mounts. By his final years of his life, he had amassed a massive personal library, but he didn't take care of any of his books or his collections and just threw them in piles, and they were referred to as piles of junk. He was less of a naturalist and more of a taxidermist and 19th century hoarder. He never found true success in the United States and eventually in the 1850s traveled back to London to where he would live and die alone in his final years. By the time Bartholomew had went back to London, Thomas Corbett was already out on his own, and he was training as a silk hat finisher. That was a pretty popular trade because, of course, it's the 1850s and people like their fancy hats. Hat making was impacted by the Industrial Revolution as well. Innovators and tinkerers made machines that could make hat blocks in minutes rather than hours that it took by hand. This led to new specialized jobs as operators and finishers, which is exactly what Boston Corbett would do. The hat making industry was one of the first to unionize. They controlled who would become apprentices, and they struggled, but they did set floor wages for the factories. Some of these factories were massive, employing hundreds of men and women. The men would operate machinery and stretch the hat and clean the felt. Women would finish hats, by attaching the belts, the bows, and the buttons, making the hats look extra fancy for the purchaser. Being in the workforce in the 1850s wasn't the easiest thing, though. Most jobs were incredibly dangerous, including hat making, which we'll cover here in just a second. The biggest impact of the 1850s is alcohol was safer to drink than water. So in the 1850s, everybody was just constantly hammered. So much so, in fact, that they believed drinking on the job would increase vigor and vitality, which is absolutely insane. But let's be real, who hasn't been at work and thought, man, I could use a drink right about now? As mentioned, Thomas Corbett entered hat making as an apprentice, and hat making was a close knit, hard drinking industry, and so everybody drank. But there was much more to hat making than hard drinking and camaraderie in the unions. It was also a pretty dangerous job. In order to make the fur easier to remove from the felt, they used mercury infused steam, and when that was inhaled, it was extremely toxic. The combination of mercury fueled chemicals made it easier to remove the fur and to shape the hats. Pretty much every process that goes into hat making had mercury involved, and the men who ingested it eventually got mercury poisoning, which led to slurred speech. They were irritable. In extreme cases, they showed signs of paranoia. And of course, mercury poisoning wouldn't be diagnosed nor created until 3 decades later. And by the 1930s, they used the term mad as a hatter to describe the insane behavior. Though Thomas Corbett was a hat maker, the amount he endured of mercury poisoning is truly unknown and never will be known. But he definitely did show symptoms of mercury poisoning later on in life. In the early 1850s, Thomas would meet Susan Rebecca, and it's Susan Rebecca because her last name doesn't appear in any public records. Apparently, Thomas liked himself a cougar because Susan Rebecca was 13 years older than Thomas. The two eventually got married and moved into an apartment, and there's not much for records about their relationship. It was really unclear how much religion had to do with their relationship, but there was a quote saying, "What a good Christian wife and what a pleasant home he had." Other than that quote, there are no other references in regard of Corbett being a God-fearing man in his early life. Corbett would continue making hats, which led to him moving from hat-making town to hat-making town, including a stint in 1854 in Troy, New York. During his time in Troy, Thomas decided to make the switch from an English citizen to an American citizen, and that got finalized on the court steps of the Troy courthouse. However, the Corbetts didn't stay in Troy long. They would eventually find their way to Richmond, Virginia. But because Boston Corbett was staunchly against slavery, he had a really, really hard time finding work and keeping work in the South. While in Richmond, things would take a turn for the worse when Susan fell ill. And in 1856, on their way back to New York, Susan died on August 1856, at sea. Her death would be recorded when they got back to New York, where she was buried. And rightfully so, Susan's death really, really took a toll on Thomas. He started just binging, started drinking and drinking and drinking, and formed a serious problem. During Thomas's binge after Susan's death, he would encounter a group of evangelical temperance Christians, and those guys are pretty damn serious. Think about the term evangelical temperance Christians in New York City in the 1850s. These guys saw New York as proof that the devil worked through whiskey. These guys were literally the real-life Handmaid's Tale. Temperance wasn't just about abstaining, it was a moral war, and New York was ground zero. The evangelical temperance Christians believed that total abstinence was a spiritual imperative and that alcohol corrupted the body, which is true, but not in a sense that they thought, because, the body is God's temple. And they believed that sobriety brought salvation, self-control, and civic virtue. In all reality, their beliefs were pretty standard to modern religion today, but their strategies and their tactics to convert people were absolutely batshit crazy. And they included the following: revival meetings and sermons that targeted the working class drinkers, temperance pledges, signed commitments to abstain from alcohol, often done with a public crowd. Women's activism. Mothers and wives were portrayed as victims to male drunkenness and were viewed as moral crusaders. Though the women's activism isn't a bad thing, because of this movement, they made a lot of headway with the Suffrage Act. Oh, and we can't forget the craziest strategy that they had, which is kidnapping drunken men, sex workers, and children off the streets of New York with no notice. Most of the time when they were abducting these people, they were backed by police officers when they were raiding homes for children, bars and brothels, and gambling dens, most of the time without due process. Most children were taken out of poor or immigrant homes and placed into religious houses so they could be reformed. Many of the women that were abducted were sent to what were called Magdalene homes. They sent these women here to rescue them from prostitution and drinking. They pretty much placed them into religious homes so they could become good religious wives. And while in these homes, refusal to submit to discipline would result in isolation or punishment. That is absolutely insane. That would not fly in today's world. The men abducted were sent to reform ships or farm placement under the guise of recovery or work training. In some cases, men deemed hopeless drunks would be tricked into going for a walk and wake up in farm colonies or dry out asylums. That is absolutely insane. Like, could you imagine? You're like, hey, buddy, you want to go for a walk? And then somebody knocks you out and you wake up a couple days later in a random farm colony far from civilization or in a prison. Like, it'd be terrifying. Now, I know you're probably asking, how is any of this legal? Well, that was a gray area. It was the 1850s in New York. The Miranda rights didn't exist, and most people couldn't afford to take legal recourse. Thomas Corbett was detained by the evangelical temperance Christians. Their reform worked on Thomas just a little too well. While he was detained, he had a religious epiphany. By the summer of 1858, Corbett moved to Boston, and by this time he had already been converted to religion. While in Boston, he fell in with members of the Methodist Episcopal Church, where he found a new home and a calling. Thomas became a proselytizer and a street preacher, exhorting his fellow sinners to refuse the temptation of drink and sin. But even though Thomas had given up alcohol, he was still human. He had a hard time struggling with his sexual urges and had a really tough time remaining chaste. Being the devout Christian he was, he pored over chapters 18 and 19 of the Gospel of Matthew until he found the answer that he was looking for. And it reads, I quote, Woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. Wherefore, if thy hand or thy foot offend thee, cut them off, and cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life halt or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. And if thine eyes offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast to the hellfire. Pretty intense stuff. So what do you think Thomas is going to do with that information? What made Corbett struggle wasn't his hands, feet, or eyes. It was his libido, and he prayed for the strength to overcome his desires. Matthew 19 offered what he believed was the answer. Eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake would fall under God's good graces. This story is about to get real intense. So forewarning, it's going to get a little graphic. So if you're kind of queasy, you might want to skip ahead a little bit. Thomas's friend later recorded that he told him that the Lord had given him a vision or in some way told him to castrate himself. On July 16th, 1858, Thomas Corbett grabbed a pair of scissors, sliced open the bottom of his scrotum, pulled his testicles downward, and cut them free. And apparently, he handled this with incredible stoicism. Not me. I can't even begin to imagine what was going through his head, and I really, really don't want to. After my man cut his nuts off, he promptly went down to the church for a prayer meeting and had himself a hearty dinner. While at the prayer meeting, the fluids and blood began to back up in Thomas's scrotum and began to swell to enormous sizes and turned his ball bag black. When Corbett returned to his room, somebody had sent for Dr. Richard Manning Hodges to check him out and see if they could fix him. Dr. Dick cleaned the incision, drained the wound, tied off the epididymis and the vas deferens, stitched it all up, and sent Thomas Corbett to Massachusetts General Hospital. While at the hospital, Corbett began to have more issues due to the immense swelling in his scrotum and began to have intestinal problems. So how did the doctors fix this? Well, the day after he cut his fucking nuts off, they gave him an enema to release the intestinal pressure. After about a month stay in the hospital, on August 15th, Corbett was pronounced healed and released. After his recovery, he was very satisfied with his results, as his passion wasn't troubled anymore. He said that his object was that he might preach the Gospels without being tormented by his passions. 2 weeks after being released from the hospital, Thomas formalized his union with the Methodist Episcopal Church. Believing he was following a tradition of the apostles, Thomas changed his name from Thomas to Boston because that's the city where his rebirth took place. Pretty fucking nuts, huh? After the formerly known Thomas Boston Corbett's absolutely batshit crazy rebirth, my man started patterning himself after Jesus Christ. He grew his jet black hair out and split it down the middle, the way Jesus Christ did it. Boston Corbett, keep in mind, looked nothing like Jesus Christ. He was described as a fiery if unimposing man with a compact body, a short neck, a low, wide forehead, and dark eyes to match his hair. That has got to be one of the most brutal descriptions I've ever heard. To make matters worse, he was described to look like a woman when he was clean shaven. Thomas was actually really friendly, open to anybody, and would help anybody in need, but he would absolutely light you up if he thought you were out of step with God. While in church, Boston would tuck his chin into his chest and don what was often called an annoying accent, where he would put an ER on the end of every word, as in, Lorder, hearer, our prayer. And to make matters worse, he was quick with a good old amen, and even more often, glory to God. And he belted these out with a high, driving voice. These actions in church earned him the nickname of the Glory to God Man. Despite Boston Corbett being an absolute cartoon of a character, he was extremely passionate and a very good person with an unshakable belief in God. Corbett worked in Boston for a little while, but eventually moved back to New York, where he would become a hat finisher for James H. Brown in 1859. But his true calling was being a minister for the evangelist. While being a minister in New York, he met a fellow minister for the evangelist, a man known by Orville Gardner, and this man is an absolute legend. Gardner was a massive man, described as physically powerful and imposing, with all rights because the man was a prized bare knuckle fighter. And in 1847, he won $800 by outlasting Alan McPhee in an absolute war of attrition that lasted 33 rounds in an hour and 19 minutes. And it didn't have to be in a boxing ring for Orville Gardner to fight. Sometimes he fought just for the love of the game. His life was way worse than Corbett's coming up. I mean, Corbett's life truly paled in comparison to Orville Gardner's. Orville Gardner was arrested multiple times for just whooping wholesale ass. Like in 1851, he accosted a woman on the streets, started fighting her husband until a group of onlookers figured out, hey, we're not just fucking NPCs and we can help this person. And so a mob of people started attacking Gardner and chased him all the way to the front of a hotel, where eventually Gardner pulled out a pistol, fired 2 shots, and one of them injured a man in the face. It's unclear whether any charges were brought against Gardner at this point, but they should have been. 2 years later, in 1853, Gardner was arrested again after biting a chunk off of a fellow fighter in an unsanctioned bare-knuckle fight. Like, way before Mike Tyson, he originated taking a bite out of your opponent. Then, in 1855, he was arrested again after he broke a tourist's jaw when the tourist refused to go to Gardner's favorite bar after Gardner had recommended him to check it out. Then in 1856, Gardner and a few of his buddies decided to go across the Jersey River for a night out on the town. And while absolutely hammered, they started destroying shit. They threw bricks through street lamps. And then later, when the police showed up, he got into a tuft with one of his buddies and ended up getting arrested and actually being sent to prison. And it was after he got out of prison that he would find God. After prison, Gardner would go visit his brother, who was swept up in the Great Revival movement of 1857 and 1858. And out of kindness, he would just join them to go to church. Because of these few trips to church, Gardner kind of started to feel the power of religion a little bit. Gardner was quoted saying, "It worked on me for 3 or 4 nights. Then the pastor of the church came to me and asked me if I would not like to get religion and serve God," to where he reluctantly declined and said, "I had to get out of that part of the country as it was getting a little too warm for me." But it didn't just end like that. After a few days of feeling the clutches of religion, Gardner found himself at the front of the church, confessing his sins, and then he felt nothing. Gardner felt nothing until he was riding a horse with a friend to White Plains and he started singing hymns. And then it hit him like a bullet. And then the first thing he said was, "Glory, God blessed." At least that's how it was described by Gardner to a journalist that was widely published for a while. And the journalist didn't even believe that a recidivist like Gardner could be turned to religion and lead a better life. But it really did work on him. Eventually, Gardner owned a coffee shop in the Bowery for his fellow down men, and it was funded by wealthy New Yorkers. On top of that, he would make prison visits, specifically Sing Sing, and he would speak at regional camp meetings, the same circuit that Boston Corbett was on. Boston Corbett and Orville Gardner would end up being lifelong friends. Boston Corbett, however, really was a good person. He really was the Christian that most people wouldn't have the nerve or energy to be. He would regularly take drunken sinners to his home where he would revive them back to health and sober them up and help them in any way that he could. He even gave them his clothes to the point where he had no more decent clothes for himself. Boston would try to find these men work when he could, and he provided so much for them that he would run out of money and ask friends and family for loans that he would somehow pay back within just a few days without fail. Boston Corbett did this all the time, and there was no talking him out of it. This is something that would go on for years. His boss, James H. Brown, later wrote, "I don't think there was ever a person born just like him, but he was a good man, for all the faults were of his head and not of the heart." Boston's younger brother, John, would often send him letters of care along with money, but he would never send him large sums of money because Boston would just give it all away. But John would send him money whenever he asked or needed it. He would send the money to James and the letters to ensure that Boston got them. Through Boston's involvement with the church and him reviving sinners back to health and all this, he developed an unruly righteousness. So much so that if he thought that an employer was being ungodly, he would just quit. In one instance, he believed that one of his employers was selling used hats as new and just left. While at work, if another one of the hatters would curse around Boston, he would fall to the floor, hit his knees, and begin a prayer for forgiveness, which is absolutely insane. Could you imagine seeing that? You say shit at work, and it just sends your coworker into a frenzy. Needless to say, that never kept Corbett down. He would jump from shop to shop when he needed to, as well as being a minister and taking care of his sinners. Sometime in the late 1850s, Corbett would meet Phoebe Palmer and her family, who had lost 3 small children. And this is really another truly crazy story. Phoebe Palmer was extremely religious. She was a traveling preacher and a theologian for the mystical Methodist. She believed the death of her first 2 children were divine chastenings of God for loving her children too much rather than embittering herself to God. And it was a sign for her to reevaluate her life and consecrate herself more to God. Phoebe Palmer truly believed that her husband and her children were standing between her and God, which is an absolutely batshit crazy thing to think, especially from a mother. Aside from being absolutely insane, Phoebe would hold weekly sermons just for women, later allowing men to join, and they quickly grew to over 300 members. And then later on, she would write over 18 books on religion. Her works would help find the Pilgrim's Holiness Church, the Church of Nazarene, and eventually the Salvation Army. It's a pretty big deal for one woman to help found all of that stuff. It's unknown when Boston and Phoebe's paths crossed, but needless to say, Corbett loved Phoebe Palmer's works. One primary belief that Boston latched onto was that it's possible to live days, weeks, months, and years in succession without committing any sin in word, thought, or deed. And that would later frame Boston Corbett's entire life. Thank you for joining me for another episode of another history podcast. On the next episode, we'll go over Boston's time in the war and Andersonville prison, and of course, him pulling the trigger on Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth. Don't worry, there is way more insane shit to come. I hope to see you next time. And again, thank you. If you enjoyed, remember to smash that subscribe button so you can catch the next episode.